Let's begin, and our colleagues will join us as we move along. It is always such a great pleasure to welcome the sector to these important conversations. I thank you for joining us today on March 6th. Um, I am speaking to you, and this webinar is being hosted on the traditional territory of the Wendat, Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, and most recently the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations, Toronto, which is now home to many Indigenous peoples, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. My name is Debbie Douglas, and I am the Executive Director of OCASI. It is important to us and for me from the outset to express our solidarity with Indigenous communities across Turtle Island who continue to experience colonial violence, including race and gender-based violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. At OCASI, we have made a commitment in our most recent strategic plan to be an ally by incorporating the truth and reconciliation calls to action and the calls to justice from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report into all of our policy and advocacy work. OCASI has been engaged in a number of priority initiatives, including addressing racial equity in the immigrant and refugee sector through conducting an environmental scan, developing an anti-racism, confronting anti-Black racism, and anti-Indigenous racism framework for policy and practice. We continue to work with member agencies and in partnership with the City of Toronto and others to move this work forward. As part of our capacity development mandate, we have made an ongoing commitment to build on our own internal capacity, as well as the capacity of the immigrant and refugee serving sector to deepen our understanding of the history of the original inhabitants of this land and to build relationships of solidarity with Indigenous communities. We have done this through revising our existing course content, including keynote speakers and guests, to facilitate deep conversations in our annual professional development conferences, our national gender-based violence conferences and webinars, as well as developing two new courses more recently, which are specifically focused on Indigenous solidarity. It is important for me as a Black woman, especially outside of the month of February, Black History, Futures, Liberation Month, to remember, celebrate, and commemorate the many Black people who have contributed in building the nations of the Americas, including the Caribbean. This month, when we celebrate working women, I especially honor Black African-descended women, and I acknowledge and call on my ancestors whose ingenuity and deep knowledge of self supported their survival of the brutal experience of the transatlantic slave trade and their enslavement over 400 years in these lands, including here in Canada. It is because of their struggle for liberation and freedom, a struggle that is ongoing, that I sit here today. And so I pay homage to them and I give thanks. It is and I'm pausing so that you can reflect on the space where you are and the land where you are and how it is that you are in relations with the land, but more important, how you are in relations with First Peoples of this land. It is my great pleasure to introduce our series moderator, Dhir. Dhir, from grassroots organizing to nonprofit leadership, Dhir has supported and led change efforts in communities, organizations, and nonprofit sectors, and collaborated with residents and decision makers across the City of Toronto. Dhir has over 2 decades of experience in the nonprofit sector, with experience in community development, civic engagement, immigrant settlement, program development, sector development, and organizational development and change management. She has also worked in women's and 2S LGBTQ+ health, adult and popular education, community arts, and was the co-editor of Hankut, Critical Art and Writing by Korean Canadian Women. She is currently the Executive Director of Social Planning Toronto and serves on the board of Toronto Environmental Alliance, better known as T. Jin, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Debbie. And speaking about paying respects and paying homage, I am so grateful for you, for your leadership. I used to work at OCASI, and I'm grateful for OCASI's leadership as well. So I'm really happy to be here with all of you to help moderate this anti-racism webinar series. As Debbie mentioned, there's 3 in this series focused on racial equity from intention to action, part 2. So it's a webinar and conversation series hosted by OCASI for the Ontario immigrant and refugee serving sector to move from intention to action in understanding systemic racism, addressing racial discrimination, and building towards racial equity in the sector and beyond. So throughout these 3 sessions, guest experts will speak about community safety, policing and alternatives, and countering hate and discrimination. And we'll talk about how this all impacts the immigrant and refugee serving sector as we work towards advancing racial equity and what more we need to do. So today, our second in the series of 3 conversations, we will focus on hate crimes and their impact on individuals and communities, what's been done and what more can be done to combat hate crimes and racism. Now, as someone who has spent most of my adult life learning about and working to combat racism and other forms of discrimination, I know a lot less about hate crimes. I know that when we talk about hate crimes, I think many of us tend to think about attacks on mosques and synagogues. We think about Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. Perhaps many of us think about anti-Asian racism, hate, and bias, and the Atlantic spa shootings, where Asian women massage parlor workers were targeted. 8 people were killed, 6 of whom were of Asian descent. And we're actually approaching the 2-year anniversary of the Atlanta spa shootings. And then we hear less about the connection between anti-Black racism and hate crimes. So I'm wondering if that's something that will get spoken to today. We've also heard during the pandemic about a concerning rise in hate crimes in the context of a public health emergency, fear, and economic crises. We're seeing significant increases in hate crimes and anti-Asian racism in particular, but probably other forms of hate crimes as well. And we have continued to witness ongoing anti-Semitic and Islamophobic hate crimes as well. So today we have the opportunity to dive deeply into this area in the context of the immigrant and refugee serving sector. We'll talk about what is a hate crime, different forms of hate crimes, and how they look and feel for different communities, what people and organizations can do to support those targeted by racism and hate, and to foster a safer environment for everyone. And then we'll talk about what progress or lack thereof we have seen, and what else needs to be done to address hate and racism. So if you require French interpretation, then you can hit the interpretation button on the bottom bar of your screen and choose the French option. We are also offering simultaneous closed captioning transcription services, and you can click the closed caption button, I believe there is one, and choose the English option. Show captions is the specific button. So now we're going to move to our conversation with our guest experts. We have 4 lovely guests with us today. First, I'm going to introduce each of them one at a time and then ask them to introduce themselves. And then we'll have a bit of a conversation amongst ourselves, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A. So please consider asking a question. You can share it in the chat, and we'll get to it at the end of the conversation. Now there is a survey that will be emailed to you at the end of the webinar. So please, please, please fill that survey out so we know how we did with the session. So now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our 4 speakers, Bernie, Nuzhat, Raj, and Kiran. So first, Bernie Farber with the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. Bernie Farber's career spans more than a quarter century, focused on human rights, anti-racism, pluralism, and inter-ethnic faith and race relations. His efforts have been documented in numerous Canadian human rights publications, books, newspapers, and magazines, and cited in a number of academic publications. Bernie has successfully run large NGOs and foundations such as the Canadian Jewish Congress, the Paloma Foundation, and he recently retired as executive director of the Mosaic Institute. Today, Bernie is a human rights consultant, newspaper columnist, and social justice advocate. He's received numerous awards for his civil rights work, including the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal, the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police Award for outstanding service and dedication, and many others. So welcome, Bernie. That was the official bio. Please introduce yourself and share a bit more about your work. Do we have Bernie?
Bernie's muted.
Sorry, I have to take myself off mute.
Yeah,
even after all,
we're gonna have to charge you $10.
even after all these years, I'm still unmuting. Anyhow, thank you very much, and thank you to the conveners of this very important webinar. I wish I wasn't here today, to be quite honest with you. I've worked in the field of hate crime now for more than 3 decades, and I am supposed to be officially retired. But the fact of the matter is that I'm still here. And not only am I still here, but I remain laser focused on the fact that hate crime has not gone down, but in fact it has risen. And we have seen some very disturbing effects of hate crime. Back in the day, as was noted, we were more concerned with words than we were with actions. Today, however, it has really moved from what I would call, words of derision and words of hatred to actual violence, including murder. And we've seen that here in Canada as well. So the work that I have done, whether it was with the Canadian Jewish Congress or presently with the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, is really focused on confronting hatred, confronting groups that promote hatred, which we'll talk a little bit more about, and having the general public understand the role that they have to play in dealing with hate crime. So all of this will be touched upon. I could speak for another 25 minutes on that alone. I'm not going to. I'm going to pass it back to the moderator to introduce my fellow panelists, and we will take it from there. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Bernie. Looking forward to it. So next, I'd like to introduce Nuzhat Jafri, who's the Executive Director of the Canadian Council of Muslim Women. She served as president and longtime national board member and volunteer with the council, and has served on the board of directors of the Pluralist Foundation and several other nonprofit boards, including Access Employment and South Asian Family Support Services. Nuzhat has wide-ranging leadership experience in the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors, including serving as the executive director of the Office of the Fairness Commissioner from 2007 to 2017. Her experience spans leadership roles in policy, communications, human resources, and legislative and regulatory compliance. She's an untiring advocate for human rights, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. It's great to have you here, Nuzhat. Please introduce yourself.
Okay, I remember to unmute. Thank you so much. So I'm Nuzhat Jafri. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Council of Muslim Women. And like Bernie, I thought I'd retired actually, but I came back to this particular role because our work never seems to be done. And I too wish we weren't here having to advocate for basic human rights, safety for each person. and accessibility for all. But here we are. And of course, all of you have heard the stories, read the news, watched the TV programs that report on the scourge that we have of, murders being committed against people of different faith communities, of different, racialized communities. Anti-Black racism seems to be pervasive and is not going away anytime soon. So we, at the council, we do a lot of work to address these issues because so many of the members of our communities are experiencing hate directly, either by walking in the street or taking the subway or going to school. So it's very, very urgent for us to address this and be here with all of you. And I'm really here to learn from my colleagues because they're working in spaces that are similar but quite distinct in some cases. So I'd like to learn how we can work together. And thank you, OCASI and Debbie and Leah, everyone here for inviting us. Thank you, Jen. Over to you.
Thanks, Nuzhat. As much as I want you to be peaceful in your retired life, it's really great to have you here with us. So next, I'm going to introduce Raj Dhir, who's been the Executive Director and Chief Legal Counsel at the Ontario Human Rights Commission since 2018. He oversees all of the OHRC's operations, including legal, policy, communications, and corporate services. He was previously a portfolio director with the Ministry of the Attorney General Civil Law Division, where he spent over a decade in a variety of management roles, including as legal director at the former Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation. Raj also spent over 11 years as counsel at the OHRC, where he litigated and advised on a variety of human rights matters and appeared before administrative tribunals and at all levels of court, including the Supreme Court of Canada. So great to have you, Raj. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Jen. So as you've all heard, my name is Raj Dhir. I'm the Executive Director and Chief Legal Counsel at the Ontario Human Rights Commission. I think you've said it all in terms of my bio and my career path. Just a couple of things maybe to note. As counsel at the Ontario Human Rights Commission, I've litigated numerous human rights cases before tribunals and courts, including many cases that involve different manifestations and forms of hate and discrimination. And I also was one of the founding members of the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario. And as many of you are likely aware, SALCO has done quite a bit of work in this space as well. So very proud of all of that. And very proud to be here on behalf of the Ontario Human Rights Commission today. The Ontario Human Rights Commission just launched a new strategic plan for 2023 and 2025. And part of that plan commits the Commission as a priority to engage in more anti-hate work. And we are committed to working with other institutions to challenge and address the increase that we're seeing in different forms of hate expression and help ensure that public institutions, individuals, and groups know how to use the human rights system to respond to hate.
Great. Thanks so much, Raj. And thanks for all the important work that the OHRC does, and great to hear about your connection to SALCO as well, such an important resource for community members. So last but not least, I want to introduce Kiran Bisla, who is a 21-year member with the Toronto Police Service. She is a detective with the TPS Hate Crime Unit and has served in this position for over 12 years. During this time, Kiran has been involved in a number of high-profile hate-motivated criminal investigations, both at a municipal and multi-jurisdictional level. She delivers training regularly at the Toronto Police College and Ontario Police College to officers from across the province, and she represents the TPS as part of the Hate Crime and Extremism Investigative Team. Welcome, Kiran.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Jen, and thank you, OCASI, for having me here today. I am one of 2 detectives that's currently assigned to the Toronto Police Service Hate Crimes Unit. And just to speak a little bit about our mandate, our unit, we review every hate crime occurrence as well as every hate incident report that is filed with our service. We review them, we classify them to determine whether or not they meet that criminal threshold or whether or not there are hate incidents. I can get a little bit more into that a little bit later. We provide support and expertise to the divisional officers. We liaise regularly with the Ministry of the Attorney General in hate-related investigations. And some of my fellow panelists have mentioned, there was an increase over the pandemic, and as we know, international events do have a local impact here, and we definitely did see a rise in hate crime reporting over the pandemic. And in response to that, the Toronto Police Service expanded our hate crime unit, which is it's fantastic. For us, because it gives us the ability to expand our scope and look at investigations and provide education to the members of the public as well, so they are better able to identify hate crime occurrences. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Kiran. And I'm actually keen to hear about what meets the threshold of a hate crime. So I'd like to ask you first, what is a hate crime and what impact does it have on the communities that you work with?
Thank you, Jen. So this is a complex area, so I'll try and keep it simple, but the criminal code has specific hate propaganda, hate crime provisions, but there's also sentencing provisions. So what that means is any criminal offense can be a hate crime. The police have to show evidence of hate, bias, or prejudice. So we really rely on statements, on evidence to show the courts that these aren't isolated incidents, that the offense themselves were motivated either in part or in whole because of the suspect's perception, whether it's real or perceived, meaning the person doesn't necessarily have to identify with a specific particular community group. It's based on the suspect's perception. So the police are required to show that evidence. So if an individual is charged, the courts are then required to take into consideration hate as an aggravating factor, which means a higher increase on sentencing. These criminal offenses are very different from other offenses because of the impact that they have on the community. Regardless of whether or not you or myself are members or subjected to that specific target group, they have an impact because we are all vulnerable in these types of criminal investigations. Our service publishes an annual hate crime report that is publicly available. I believe OCASI will be providing a link to that report a little bit later, which explains how we classify hate crime occurrences, the types of offenses that are being committed in the city of Toronto. And the impact that these offenses have are very significant. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kiran. Raj, I'm wondering if you could shed some light on what a hate crime is and its impact from the perspective of human rights. And I don't know if there's a piece you want to just pick up around showing evidence and how you make the case that something is a hate crime from a human rights perspective.
Sure. I think it is really important. We've talked about how hatred is dealt with under the criminal code, in the form of hate crimes. And I think it's important to also understand how hatred is dealt with under the Ontario Human Rights Code. And in many ways, I think the Ontario Human Rights Code, human rights legislation generally, is an important place to start when we're looking at how to address hate, and we're looking at root causes of hate. And that's because hate is often at the far end of a continuum that starts with prejudice, stereotypes, negative attitudes towards individuals based on their identity, and then moves to bias, systemic discrimination, harassment, bias-motivated violence, and even sometimes in the most extreme cases, genocide. But hatred intersects with particular forms of discrimination, and it's often rooted in different forms of racism. For example, anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, anti-Indigenous racism. It's rooted in misogyny, it's rooted in homophobia, transphobia, and creed-based discrimination like anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. So if we're going to address hate, we really need to get at these forms of discrimination before they manifest into extreme forms of hate. And now the Ontario Human Rights Code, human rights legislation in Ontario, protects individuals from discrimination and harassment, which can include expressions of hate. For example, the Human Rights Code prohibits unwelcome harassment, like vexatious comments or conduct, and other forms of discrimination that negatively impact on individuals and groups in areas like employment, services, and housing. So if a person is targeted by their race, religion, or gender, as examples, in their place of employment or while receiving housing or services, the Human Rights Code is engaged. Now, while the Ontario Human Rights Code doesn't specifically regulate or mention hate speech, unlike some other human rights legislation, there's other human rights legislation in other provinces, like, for example, the BC Human Rights Act, that actually specifically regulates in that area. Discriminatory hate expression can take a variety of different forms in Ontario. I've already talked about some of those forms: unwelcome physical contact, unwelcome touching, leering, sexual advances, slurs, epithets, derogatory name calling, jokes, cartoons, graffiti, ridiculing comments, rude and insulting language. All of that has been found to be included under these provisions in the Human Rights Code. And what that means is that hate expression that may be a crime under the criminal code, if it happens in particular social areas that are legislated under the Human Rights Code, like employment, housing, and services, it may also be the subject of discriminatory harassment under the Human Rights Code as well. The other thing I think that's important to note is that the Ontario Human Rights Code also prohibits the display of a notice, sign, symbol, emblem, or other similar representation that shows an intent to discriminate or harass, or an intent to provoke others to discriminate and harass in one of the protected social areas based on a protected identity. Now, unfortunately, that protection doesn't extend to a lot of the contemporary forms of hate expression that we see, that we're dealing with today, including hate publications and online hate. But those provisions still exist, and they're still important to take sight of. And the other thing that I think is important to note is that there are typically no human rights protections available for hate incidents that don't occur, in between two people who are in a duty holder, rights holder relationship in the code. So, if you're not in the context of employment or housing or services or some of the other social areas, then the Human Rights Code is not engaged. And will not apply, to comments that are just made between two people, for example, in a public square or online, via social media, if they're done in the absence of a social area.
That's great. Thanks so much, Raj. It's really helpful to think about hate crimes as part of that continuum connected to different forms of prejudice and discrimination, and it's kind of on the extreme version end of it, and talking about getting at the root causes and addressing it before it gets to violence or hate crimes. And then seeing how the human rights piece covers, in addition to the legal aspect of hate crimes from the police side. So it sounds comprehensive, but you made note of some gaps, and maybe we'll get to that in a minute. But first I want to ask Nuzhat, from your perspective, what is a hate crime and what have you seen in terms of impact in communities?
So I think, Kiran and Raj both addressed you know, what constitutes a hate incident, what constitutes a hate crime. The threshold for a hate crime to be proven, you know, is really challenging for people. So, you know, before any charges can be laid or, you know, goes to the courts, Kiran, correct me if I'm wrong, you know, the report occurs and then the police determine whether or not, you know, it can move to a criminal offense and what to do with it. In our, you know, in our daily lives, things like name calling, you know, that in itself cannot, it's not easy to prove that that's a hate crime because of the threshold that has to be proven, the, you know, the intent, the evidence, and so on. So it's very challenging. And in our communities, many people don't actually report any incidents that could in fact be hate crimes because they, you know, they perceive they will not be taken seriously, they will not be heard. There's a lot of perception in our communities that law enforcement, you know, is, you know, rightly or wrongly, the perception exists that Muslims may not be taken seriously. And sometimes people think that we're used to violence because, you know, many of us come from, we're parts of diaspora where violence was a common occurrence. So I'm just giving you some examples of why, you know, there's some resistance in the community to come forward, and then the experience of not being taken seriously. So one of the things that I would really like to see happen is a really clear, first of all, we don't have a, you know, very specific or clear definition of hate crime, even under the criminal code. It sort of explains to you what it is, and when it could be constituted as a hate crime, and then there's sort of like a two-step process. So it would be really important to have very clear definitions. And just jurisdictionally, there are differences, like Raj said, between, you know, different jurisdictions and how hate crimes are defined, and the distinction between a hate incident and a hate crime. So in very plain language, if you could just explain to the public, you know, what the differences are and what the recourses are. They're different, you know, in each jurisdiction, but even in plain language, if you did a table of provincial and territorial jurisdictions to say, okay, this is what happens. I'm sure some brilliant people have already done that. And also what is and is not possible under the criminal code would be really helpful because, you know, it's not easy to understand by the public. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Nuzhat. That's really helpful. It's important point that the incident or the crime has to be reported, and there has to be a belief that something will be done with that reporting. So of course, we need to look at when people report and when they don't. Bernie, do you want to speak a bit to the edges of where there's some gaps around hate crimes and incidents, as well as your perspective on what you've seen in the work you've done to address hate crimes?
Well, respectfully to everybody here, one of the issues that we have in dealing with hate crimes are twofold, really. First is reporting. People have to be aware and have to come forward and report hate incidents. If they're not reported, the police can't do really a heck of a lot about it. The second piece is the justice system itself. Right now, Kiran and her colleague are two hate crime investigators. But as you know, as hate incidents grow, it's urgent and it is important from my perspective anyway, somebody who has been involved in this for a very long time, to ensure that we have more investigators out there. Hate crime units, for example, used to be relatively common back before the year 2000 and into the early parts of the 21st century. They are less so today. Now, what do I mean by a hate crime unit? Like a homicide unit, like a bicycle theft unit. These are actual police officers like Kiran, whose very job it is to investigate hate crimes. And there has to be more than one or two, given the increase in hate crimes that we've seen from year to year. Most urban police forces simply do not have large anti-hate crime units. And a lot of this has to do with resources and where resources get placed. But I think if we begin to consider how things have changed, primarily how hate has spread and how it is being spread, I think we'd all sort of nod our heads in agreement. I like to tell people that, back in the day, before social media, hate mongers literally used to stand out at street corners and hand out pamphlets. And if 3 or 4 people picked up their pamphlet, that was really considered a good day. Today, it's very different. You get onto your iPad or you get onto your laptop and you press a few keys, and potentially you can reach tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people with your messages of hate. In fact, we know that people like Alexandre Bissonnette, who attacked the mosque in Quebec City, was moved to action by hate that he saw on his laptop, on social media. So we know it has that impact, and we know it's reaching tens of thousands of more people. So I think it's important that we look at how the justice system works, both from a legal perspective and, of course, a police perspective. And on the legal side of things, you have to understand that we do have anti-hate crime on the books. Kiran had mentioned it. It is a legally indictable offense to knowingly and willfully promote hatred against people identified by race, creed, color, nationality, sexual orientation, etc. But what happens if somebody is found guilty? How long does it take to work itself through the system itself? Sometimes it takes years. And so we have to take a second look at the system itself and how it works. And as importantly, if not more importantly, we have to take a look at the factors that help spread hate, the most important of which is social media. How do we begin to deal with the explosion, really, of social media and its impact on hatred?
Thanks so much, Bernie. And Raj was talking about how there's some limits in terms of the Human Rights Code with respect to social media and online hate. So I wonder if we can turn a bit now to what are some ways that you and your partners are combating hate and racism to create safer communities, either in terms of online hate or other forms of hate. So this time, could we start with Raj?
Sure. Happy to start this discussion. And I do want to just to pick up on, if I may, I'd like to try to sort of pick up on some of the points that were raised by my co-panelists. I think one thing that I think there's clearly some interest is in better understanding the different forms through which you can enforce hate incidents or hate crimes. And what I can certainly speak to, with some authority is the human rights system, and so under the human rights system, assuming that the Human Rights Code is properly engaged, victims of hate incidents can bring applications to the Human Rights Tribunal. And the tribunal can explore resolution through, mediation, it can actually conduct a hearing, and if the application is ultimately upheld, it can order individual remedies, as well as make any other orders that are in the public interest to prevent future discrimination and harassment. So the goals of the tribunal are much more restorative in nature than you might see, for example, in a criminal prosecution. The other thing that I think is important to note there is that the different standards of proof, right? An applicant before the tribunal has to prove their case on a balance of probabilities, unlike in a criminal prosecution where the Crown has to prove a hate crime beyond a reasonable doubt, which is obviously a much higher standard. I think the other thing that I would just quickly add is that another benefit of the human rights system is given kind of the more remedial and restorative goals, it's more victim-centered, right, than the criminal justice system, which is more retributive, punitive in nature. So another advantage of the system, the human rights system, is that you can more adequately perhaps challenge some of those prejudicial, discriminatory, and hateful actions that are committed by offenders, and get at some of the underlying issues, and hopefully address some of those ways of thinking and acting. I think on the other hand, I think just to finish this point, people that engage the human rights system, particularly the Human Rights Tribunal, may still feel neglected by the system due to delays, and due to how how legalistic or inaccessible it is in bringing cases forward. So if they are able to get to a tribunal hearing, sometimes what we see is that the experience of providing evidence and kind of going through that whole lengthy process may kind of re-victimize individuals, right? And may exacerbate feelings of marginalization and victimization. So I just wanted to address that piece because I do think it is important for people to understand the different fora that exist in which to bring these matters forward to try to address and enforce. Now, just to get back to your question, Jin, just in terms of some of the things that we can do, I think first of all, I want to recognize all the good work that my colleagues on this panel especially are doing to address hate expression. What we have found as we've worked in this space is that no one entity, no one organization can do this work alone. Really, it requires a multifaceted approach, usually a strategy that involves a number of different organizations and individuals. The Ontario Human Rights Commission has several tools in its mandate to address hate and discrimination. So those things include things like, we can issue statements or communications, we can develop policy, we can do training or public education, we can initiate inquiries and strategic litigation. One example, now 15 years ago, we initiated an inquiry into assaults that were taking place against Asian Canadian anglers. We released a follow-up report following that inquiry called Fishing Without Fear, which documented the progress that 22 organizations, such as the OPP, York Regional Police, Ministries of the Attorney General, and Natural Resources, school boards, among others, made, in a collective way and in a collaborative way in response to reports of harassment and assaults that were being made against Asian anglers at the time. More recently, in February 2021, there was another example that I thought was worth noting with Wabsamong Independent Nations in Northwestern Ontario. While they were fighting an outbreak of COVID, the Commission became aware of reports of businesses and organizations in Kenora that were refusing services to Indigenous people, and of various social media posts that were spreading racist comments and misinformation. And what we ended up doing in response to that was, again, working with multiple organizations and individuals. We posted a statement about the situation in Kenora, reminding everyone about their rights and obligations. We also called on businesses to follow requirements and the advice of health authorities. We wrote an op-ed. We spoke at a virtual event that was held by communities in and around Kenora. And we engaged our partner in the human rights system, the Human Rights Legal Support Center, to participate in the event as well and provide information to Wabsamong community members on how to protect their human rights. So, those are just some different examples of strategies that we've taken. The other thing is we have a history of working with stakeholders and speaking out. And so if you look at our website, you'll see many, many public statements that we've made over the years where we call out hate incidents. And I think that kind of visible leadership is really, really critical. Governments community organizations, human rights commissions, calling out hate and racism where we see it and working together to address it.
Such important work. Thanks, Raj. Nuzhat, do you want to talk about what are some of the ways you and your partners have been combating hate and racism to create safer communities?
Sure. So, we've taken a public awareness and education approach. And so we've created social media campaigns to counter what we see online using popular social media platforms. And we're finding that we have to start thinking a little bit differently about some of the older platforms like Facebook and Twitter, and the fact that younger people are moving to, whether you like it or not, TikTok, so just sort of evolving in our methods, but also in what we're communicating and how we're communicating our messages. We focus on misinformation and disinformation. We find nuggets about what people are saying about Muslims, and we counter those messages. And most recently, we ran a Hate to Healing campaign, a social media campaign, where we gave voice to Muslim women's lived experiences, where they shared their own incidents of hate, hate crimes included, and what the response was like. So, one really interesting incident that happened, which is so important for us to think about. So one featured a woman who was attacked on the SkyTrain in Vancouver, and you probably heard about her story. It's the story of Noor Fadel. So she was traumatized and attacked physically on the SkyTrain, and then, she came home after that. In order to really heal from the whole experience, she decided to share experience online. But then she experienced so much more hate online because people could say a lot more. The vitriol was shrill. It was really overwhelming for her. I admire her for coming forward and sharing both of those experiences, the physical one and the one online. But the fact that the healing process was very challenging. And we have to tell, I don't want to call them stories, because as I said, these are lived experiences of the individuals, and they didn't make these up. This is what they lived. So when they recount it, it's very brave of them to express what happened to them. And maybe it's part of their, maybe it's a cathartic, it's cathartic for them to talk about it. But the fact is, what happens out there is happening to real people. And so there are impacts on them, on their families, on their colleagues, their own sort of self-confidence. So we have to in our campaigns, when we're communicating about what this does, what hate does to people, and why it's important for us to do whatever we can to curtail it or stop it. So we've done those campaigns. We do ongoing workshops, and we do anti-Islamophobia workshops. We also do countering cyber hate workshops. We began by equipping our own members, our own communities, on how to do it. But because the platforms are forever evolving and the landscape for any regulation is so unpredictable, we still don't have the legislation that people have been asking for, especially on online safety or online harms. And then there are lots of free expression advocates. So this fine balance between freedom of expression and, stopping hate. We're working in spaces where we come together to figure out what the best solutions are. It's not easy, but we do a lot of allyship. We do a lot of alliance building, and we worked with OCASI. In fact, our first campaign was in collaboration with OCASI. So it's really important to do that work together rather than in our silos. I'll stop. So much more to share, but please have a look at our daretobeaware.ca website, where our resources reside on this work. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Nuzhat, and we'll be sure to share that resource out after the session is done today. Bernie, could you share a bit about what you and some of your partners have been doing to combat hate and racism?
The most important thing that we
Are
have
you on
done.
mute?
No, not anymore. Can you hear me now? Yep. Okay.
You're good. Thanks.
Good. One of the most important things that we've done at the Canadian Anti-Hate Network is actually confronting hatred itself. It's a very dark and dangerous place, especially on social media, as I had mentioned earlier. And it takes kind of a special type of an investigator to get in there and to take a look at what's going on. And all I have to do really is point to what happened just a little over a year ago right now, and that was the whole issue around the Freedom Convoy and their setup in Ottawa. That was one of the first times that we actually saw Nazi flags flying on Parliament Hill. It actually paved the way for new groups to develop, groups like Diagolon and others. And so the Canadian Anti-Hate Network has made it its goal, if you will, to identify who the haters are and then work with other investigators and other researchers in order to ensure that police and other members of civil society have the information that is required to understand the levels of hatred that are out there. And let's really not fool ourselves. I mean, it's all been mentioned before. Whether you're a person of color, whether you're a person of the Jewish faith, if it's Islamophobia, if it's anti-LGBTQ plus discrimination, it's happening in our schools, it's happening in our playgrounds, it's happening online, and we have to know much more about it. One of the things that we have really been advocating, and we do both through the Anti-Hate Network and through work that I do on a private basis, is to provide workshops for school boards to help them identify issues like anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, anti-LGBTQ, et cetera, and how to identify which of those students in their classrooms may be prime targets for haters to recruit through their various different networks. All of this takes resources, all of this takes time, but it's time well spent. You know, if you ask me, if we are able to actually use the education system to do what it's supposed to do, and that is to educate both teachers and students, but have teachers being able to identify root causes before they even begin, we might be on a path to at least lessening the kind of hatred that we're seeing.
That's great. Thanks so much, Bernie. And Kiran, I'm wondering if you can now talk a bit about your work at combating hate and racism and, addressing the increasing demands that we're seeing with more and more hate and increase in hate, as well as addressing the online forums that we're seeing more and more of.
Sure, not a problem. I just want to touch on some of the points that I guess have been raised, and acknowledge that underreporting, as Nuzhat mentioned, is a huge concern, because the Toronto Police, we need to know what's happening in our communities, and we can only know that if individuals are reporting, regardless of whether something is a hate incident or a hate crime, because it helps us identify trends. And underreporting. We've heard some of the reasons why people may not want to come to the police and report, because it can be difficult. And unless the police are asking the right questions, the hate piece may get missed. So the incident may be classified as a criminal offense, for example, an assault, where somebody has been punched or slapped or spat on. But unless the police are able to get the additional evidence of, were there racial slurs made? Where were you at the time of the offense? Why do you believe you were targeted? Looking at video footage or recordings or other additional evidence, that can be missed. And those are difficult types of investigations, because victims may not want to provide that information because it's humiliating. They don't want to relive the experiences. So, that is just some of the information that we rely on as investigators when we're looking at classifying something as either a criminal offense or whether it's the, motivated by hate, bias, or prejudice piece. And in terms of hate crime units, those will vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, as it was mentioned earlier, and not all police services have a hate crime unit. I can talk about some of the work that we are currently doing. Toronto Police Service is part of the RCMP's and Canadian Race Relations Hate Crime Task Force. And what the task force is working on currently is standardizing ways on how we are reviewing, reporting, classifying hate crimes, including developing a standard definition that all police services can use. One definition for a hate crime, which is mentioned earlier, is a criminal offense where there's evidence of hate, bias, or prejudice. And it could be any criminal offense that is targeting a person or property, versus a hate incident, which is a non-criminal incident, which is still equally impactful, equally hurtful in the community. And the police are able to provide resources and support for those types of incidents. Some can be referred to the Ontario Human Rights Commission. Others are deferred to, for example, the landlord and tenant tribunal, or it may not be a criminal offense, but there may be policies, as Raj mentioned previously, that people may be able to address within the workplace. Other ways that incidents can be addressed. In terms of online hate, these are very difficult investigations, because while anybody can go in and make a comment, the police, we are required to identify who the individual is. So identifying somebody as being behind a computer, being responsible for typing language, words, materials is a challenge. Jurisdiction is another challenge, because we don't know exactly where they are. Does this person reside in Canada, or is this post or comments being made outside of Canada? And these investigations, sometimes they can be lengthy. They can be lengthy because the police are required to obtain judicial authorizations to compel these companies to provide the information. And then there's the added piece of retention periods. How long are these companies maintaining those records for? So I understand some of the frustration that comes with those types of investigations, why the community may be frustrated, and reasons why they may be lengthier in those types of investigations. But this is an area of law that the police cannot do by themselves. We are very fortunate to be able to lean on the community organizations such as OCASI, Canadian Anti-Hate Network, and the Ontario Human Rights Commission to help us, because we cannot do this alone.
Thanks so much, Kiran. So much complexity here in addressing this issue. And I think in particular, the immigrant and refugee sector, you have people who are relatively new to Canada, potentially being racialized for the first time in their life, trying to name discrimination and racism in a way that's new to them. And so certainly I think identifying it as identifying a hate incident or a discriminatory incident, and then certainly being able to report it and knowing what their rights are, that's going to be quite complex. Thinking about it in the sector, but I think the sector can certainly think about how to bring that lens of hate incidents and hate crimes and what is considered such, and bring that understanding of rights to the communities. So maybe next we can talk a little bit. Oh, before I do that, I'll ask that participants who have questions, please send them to the panelists using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to the Q&A in a moment. But with one more question for each of the panelists, which is, where have we made progress? And what's more to do? So complicated. There's so much left to do. And what role can the immigrant and refugee serving sector play to combat hate and racism? Bernie, can you start us off?
Yeah. The good news is that we have made progress. In fact, having these kinds of meetings that we're having today, that's progress. We didn't have those kind of meetings even 5 years ago. School boards have begun to recognize the need to do education on on hate and anti-racism. That is also progress. Governments have begun to understand the importance of ensuring that people have as much information as possible when it comes to hate and bias crime. That is progress, but there is still, a long way to go. And the biggest area, and I've mentioned it before, and I'll continue to mention it. I was actually asked to be a participant on a federal panel looking into the whole issue of online harms. But there can be no doubt that social media has become the major tool for hate mongers today. And for those that want to spread hate, and by the way, you don't have to belong to a hate group to be a hate monger. I mean, we have many of them out there, and they're not always in the dark corners of social media either. We have them on major social media platforms, from Facebook to Twitter to Instagram to TikTok. It is all there, and that's why it's really important that people have the tools that they need to recognize what is out there and to report it appropriately. But progress can only be defined so far. Sometimes there is an uptick when something terrible happens. After the horrible massacre in London, Ontario, of an entire Muslim family, there was a kind of a communal hug that we were giving each other, and we began to understand, how hate can play roles in some of the most devastating occurrences. But that too doesn't last for all that long. And so we have to find some way of being consistent in dealing with hate. And lastly, because I want to move this on to others, but we also have to find a way for all of us to work together. That would mean, groups like the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, ethnic groups like OCASI, the Jewish groups, South Asian groups. We sometimes have this thing where we kind of go into our own pockets and do the work that if we were able to come together and do it ensemble, as a community of interest, A, there's comfort in numbers, and B, there is information and experience that many ethnic communities have that others do not have, especially when it comes to new immigrant communities, who sometimes, by the way, are rightly fearful of people in uniform, depending on where they came from, and all those issues. So sometimes when we can bring ethnic groups together who have been here for a while and can attest to the fact that Canada is different than other places, here we really do try to make an impact on those out there who are trying to spread hate. That can have a tremendously good impact in the long run. So yeah, progress has been made, but the road is still long as far as I can see.
Thanks so much, Bernie. Kiran, you talked a little bit about some of the challenges. Do you want to talk about what progress you've seen and what more there is to do?
Sorry. In terms of progress, I think our police service, Toronto Police Service, we are progressing in the sense that our unit has expanded. It's unfortunate that it happened during the pandemic because the numbers were so high, but on a positive note, prior to the pandemic, we had, 2 members. Our unit now is 6 members, which is great. And it would be great to see other police services also expand. And with that expansion, we're able to provide more education, more investigative capacity, and pay more attention to these types of investigations. What I will note is that we had developed a hate crime pamphlet, and that pamphlet was created in partnership with Humber College students. And we are now in the process of having that pamphlet translated into 20 different languages. So we hope to have that available as a resource for the community. And I think when we're talking about progression, it's really important that police services and that everybody, we're on the same page to be able to be part of the roundtable discussions alongside with my colleagues in other jurisdictions to make sure that these investigations are not being missed, and to build that trust with the community to show that we are taking these types of investigations very seriously, but there are a lot of challenges that come with those investigations. And again, just going back to, this is an area of work where we require lots of collaboration with our community partners.
Thanks so much, Kiran. Raj, do you want to talk a little bit about progress versus what's left to do and work for the immigrant and refugee serving sector as well?
Sure. So, 60 years ago, the government created the Ontario Human Rights Commission to address anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism, among other things. And sadly, it's been around for decades, and hate has been around for centuries. And while we've created these institutions, which are theoretically capable of responding, we're still here and we're still working on these issues. There are several institutional barriers to ultimately seeking redress for a hate incident through the human rights system in Ontario. I already talked about some of the gaps in the legislation. Some communities have taken the position that the 1-year limitation period is too short for many people, and has disproportionate impacts on those who are most marginalized, as well as those living in rural and remote communities. The most fundamental challenge that we've heard by far relates to underfunding. Just speaking for the Ontario Human Rights Commission, firstly, the Commission currently has 33 staff to effect a province-wide mandate to address systemic discrimination through promotion, education, policy development, inquiries, litigation. We know that the Human Rights Legal Support Centre and Legal Aid Ontario cannot provide sufficient legal assistance for drafting and filing applications for the tribunal, for the Human Rights Tribunal to address hate incidents. And we know that there are currently very long delays with the Human Rights Tribunal process. While we understand that the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario is taking steps to address the backlogs in these cases, a lot of these delays result in many people walking away from the process entirely, or not even bothering to initiate the process in the first place. And the system needs to be able to offer more than the illusion of responsiveness. I don't want to end on an entirely negative note. I agree with a lot of what Bernie was saying earlier. I think that there has been some progress. I would point to the establishment of the Anti-Racism Directorate in the Ontario government as an important step, as well as legislation that requires the collection of data, which allows us to look at forms of racism, discrimination, and hatred in a different way than we've been able to in the past, and allows us to start to look at creating the actions that are necessary to address those forms of systemic discrimination and racism. So ultimately, I think, in some respects, the responses have always been there, but I think, I think our history in the last several decades has demonstrated that we have to do a better job of supporting institutions, and we have to ultimately hold governments and each other accountable for doing the same.
That's great. Thanks so much, Raj. And Nuzhat, please wrap up this point around what progress we've seen, what more there is to do, what the sector can do.
I'll say that we have made progress in that, we're starting to look at these incidents and these crimes through an intersectional lens, because in our communities, in Muslim communities, there's been a disproportionate impact on Muslim women and girls because of their visibility. Some of them, can be identified by what they wear. And also anti-Black racism, because a lot of the incidents that have happened, have targeted Black Muslim women wearing hijab. So I think we have been communicating with, all our stakeholders, including police services and, municipalities and federal and provincial jurisdictions, that when you are, in fact, I read a really, really good report some time ago. It was a Human Rights Commission report it was called Under Suspicion, which showed you racial profiling in different sectors by different groups. What it didn't show you is how, when they intersect, when, a Black person who happens to be female, who also is a Muslim, what that experience is like for that individual. So the fact that there's recognition that intersectional identities impact different individuals differently or differentially, that recognition is there. Now the systems have to incorporate, how the data are collected, as well as how you cross-tabulate against, not against, but with all of these different intersecting identities, and also measure impacts and the severity of the incidents and crimes, because they, unfortunately, can be, they can, those things can exacerbate the experience for some folks. So I think the progress for me is that we have recognized the gendered nature of this, as well as recognizing intersectional identities. And then the other thing that we have been able to do is understand how things like, the incel movement and anti-Black racism and, anti-homophobia, or basically homophobia and transphobia, how all of these things intersect, and how they affect members of all of our communities, because, the experiences are, what can I say, compounded by all of these different factors. But there's a recognition and there's an appreciation. What I don't want to happen is for us to go backwards, because that can actually happen when you follow what's going on south of the border, with some of the legislation there, in actually prohibiting, the use of the word intersectionality from the curriculum. So we can't go there. Canada has to keep moving forward. I'll stop. I think, we'll be able to answer questions, and we'll continue the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Nuzhat. Some really great points about that intersectionality and understanding some of the complexities, and that it can't just be anti-racism alone that the sector focuses on. We have a number of questions, and we'll see how many we can get through in the next 10 minutes or so. So I'm going to pick a few of them and ask whoever on the panel would like to answer. So this first question is from Andine. Through your community engagements and research, have you learned anything about the economic impacts hate crimes and incidents have had on communities? That's a big question. Raj, I see you unmuted.
I unmuted generally, but I'm happy to try to take on at least part of the response to this. I think this is a great question, because I think that it also highlights the cost of not of failing to act, right? Which I think is really important for us to take sight of. What I would say is that based on the consultations that we've done and the work that we've done, we know that there are several impacts. Mistrust to public institutions, physical and mental harm to individuals, long-term damage to communities' collective well-being and consciousness. From the perspective of immigrants or newcomers to Canada, what we've seen in our work is certainly an increased anti-immigrant sentiment, since the pandemic, particularly towards racialized immigrants. Early in the pandemic, we noted that these sentiments were being expressed publicly over social media, as well as in schools, workplaces, and shops, that there were particular communities such as Chinese and East Asian communities that were being targeted and blamed for the pandemic. We also saw migrant workers being exposed to different forms of discrimination. For example, in August of 2021, the town of Kingsville passed an interim bylaw prohibiting any person from using any lands, buildings, or structures for the purposes of housing agricultural workers anywhere other than on the lands that they were employed. So this was, clearly a very concerning discriminatory bylaw, and we wrote a letter to the town, and the town then took steps to revise its bylaw, and ultimately that was what was passed by council. And all of this comes at a time when we also know that 1/3 of employers are reporting labor shortages. There's been a reduction, and this is pretty widely reported, there's been a reduction in the size of the labor pool and in expertise for jobs, which has led in Canada to lower economic input, slower growth, and lower overall prosperity. So Canada needs immigration, but why would immigrants want to come if they're being subject to increasing hate when they arrive in Canada? So, I haven't, the Commission hasn't done a costing. I believe that some organizations likely have done this kind of analysis, but I think just based on what we know, there is a true economic cost to Canada, to the province in failing to act.
Thanks
There's
for that,
actually, if
Go
you
ahead,
don't
Bert.
mind, yeah, there's actually a cost to specific communities as well. So for example, the Muslim community and the Jewish community in particular, which are two of the most targeted communities in the country, have had to ensure security at their mosques and synagogues. The cost for that, even when government chips in, as both provincial and federal governments have done to provide security equipment, etc., but it is an economic burden. It is an economic cost. And if you take a look at situations in places like France and Italy, where actually specialized police and soldiers are sometimes stationed around synagogues and around mosques, it does have a financial impact, never mind the psychological impact of going to synagogue on a Saturday or going to the mosque on a Friday, and for the first time sitting down and having to check out the exits and having to think about this place of faith now being a place of fear. So both economically and psychologically, it is something for us always to consider.
Yeah. Can I just address that as well, Jen? So,
Go for it, Nuzhat.
in our communities, there has been a real, economic cost, particularly to women who are teachers in Quebec, who want to work in the judiciary, or who want to work in law enforcement. They cannot work. So there's a direct economic cost. If they wear the hijab, they cannot work in their chosen professions for which they have paid to be educated and licensed to be able to practice their professions. And suddenly they can't. So they've had to move sometimes. That means displacement of themselves, their families, their overall economic well-being is affected. But another really important, economic impact is to their mental health. And once you've experienced an incident, you have PTSD. It's very hard to recover from it. It takes a long time. You may have to, take time off work. And it's very hard to get, treatment because of lack of services and affordability. So all of these things are linked. I would say that mental health and economic health and social well-being are all linked, and they are the impact of hate incidents and hate crimes that members in our communities experience.
Some really great analysis and comprehensive responses to that. Great questions. So thanks for that. I think we're going to try and squeeze in one more question. We just have a few minutes left before we need to wrap up. So here's another question. I'm not sure who it's from. How do we conceptualize and address school bullying based on race, culture / country of origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, etc.? How do we respond in ways that are least likely to fuel or perpetuate ongoing hate? And how can the victims be empowered and assisted and their situations improved? So schools and school bullying and hate.
Well, I'll take a
first?
first shot at this because I said at the very beginning of the seminar that in fact schools are the first place of action, really, when it comes to hate. Why? Because our children spend the vast majority of time in school, but they're also more than likely going to experience hate in the schoolyard. I mean, I don't know of any of us who haven't seen bullying and haven't experienced hatred. And so it's vitally important today, I believe, for schools to begin to take forward action, and we're seeing it. We're seeing school boards actually beginning to address this. We are seeing school trustees beginning to address this. The whole problem for me is that a lot of this has also become political, and you know, you have certain school trustees who push one agenda around, for example, you know, the trans community, who are huge victims, by the way, of hate and bullying. And I think we have a lot of work to do there. I mean, we talk rightly so about anti-Semitism and anti-Black hatred and Islamophobia, but the kind of impact that we're seeing on young trans kids today is actually quite mind-boggling. And I don't think we've wrapped our minds around it ourselves. So there is a lot of work to do, and the school ground is really the first place. Training teachers, having them understand, you know, the root causes of trans hatred and anti-Semitism and all the other hatreds out there. This is so important, because again, if they can recognize it at its root, like any disease, you have a better chance to actually get it resolved correctly and properly.
Thanks so much, Bernie. Would anyone else like to speak to this one?
I can just touch on a couple more points. I agree with everything that Bernie just said. You know, we obviously, as a police officer, we are aware of incidents and, you know, incidents and reports that take place at schools. But, you know, I go back to my point of the schools can't do it alone either. So while there are things that are happening within the schools, it's important to have those conversations outside the classrooms as well, to encourage our kids, regardless of whether, you know, we're parents or, you know, these students are part of community or sports, sporting groups, to let them know that, you know, hate is wrong. It can't be tolerated, and the importance of reporting, because we will obviously investigate and review anything that comes to our attention, but we're also concerned about the stuff that's not being brought to the attention of the police. And it's really important that those conversations are happening both in and outside the classrooms.
Thanks so much, Kiran. I think I saw both Nuzhat and Raj unmute. So Nuzhat, would you like to go next?
Yes, I actually, it was, I saw one of the other questions, but I mean, there's lots of work to be done, and I agree with Bernie that we have to start with the schools. But one of the things that I'd like to share is that, you know, the settlement sector, especially with, you know, providing services for a lot of the times employment related, just basic, you know, housing, other kinds of settlement services that are required. That sector, you know, can benefit a lot from these types of webinars. So really glad that OCASI is doing this. But, you know, we can all offer workshops on how the systems work. Newcomers need to know that they have recourse, that, you know, a lot of these behaviors that we've just talked about are not acceptable, but that they can do something about it. And also creating spaces for them so that if they want to learn, they can come forward and ask for more learning, but also they feel safe to come forward and say, this is what I've experienced. And for us to be able to help them, you know, navigate the system. So it's really important for the sector itself to get well informed, take advantage of all of the workshops and the learning materials that we have. We're happy to offer those to the sector. So hopefully you can take us up on it, because it's so important. And not only that, you know, we do have multilingual capabilities, so we can interact with people in different languages. So please give us a call. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much. And thanks for that offer of resources and the call to action for the sector. Raj.
You know, I think that my co-panelists have done a great job in responding to this. You know, the points that I was planning to make have largely been covered. I wanted to just point out that this is a good example of one of the areas that would fall under the jurisdiction of the Ontario Human Rights Code. It's in the context of education services. So it would engage services, it might engage employment, depending on the context and the facts of the situation. As such, ministry, the ministry and school boards have certain responsibilities as duty bearers. And I think that, it triggers a lot of the things that, my colleagues have already mentioned, things like training and education, things like community engagement and seeking partnerships and, collaborative efforts to work in a collective way to try to address these issues. And I think it does involve looking at curricula as well and looking for those opportunities to educate about the roots of hate and discrimination and racism, teaching about anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and other forms of discrimination. So all of that, is what I wanted to say, which I think largely echoes what my colleagues have said. Can I just make two other quick points about resources, since we're just about to wrap up? I just wanted to do a quick plug for two things. The first is that the Ontario Human Rights Commission just today introduced its a new landing page on its website, where it organizes a lot of its hate and discrimination resources, and provides some basic information about anti-hate. So that might be of interest to people who are watching. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that tomorrow, our counterparts in British Columbia, the British Columbia Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, they are launching their final report in their inquiry into hate during the COVID-19 pandemic. And that is something that I would encourage all of you to stay tuned on. I think that that's a very comprehensive inquiry, and the report that they will be issuing, I understand, will also be very comprehensive, with numerous findings as well as recommendations, which I believe will also be of relevance to us as we are looking at how to address these issues. We can share the link with you, and you can pass that on to people who are watching this event.
That's so great. Thanks so much, Raj. And thank you to all the panelists. Thanks, Nuzhat and Kiran and Raj and Bernie, for your expertise. We just barely scratched the surface, but clearly a lot of work is happening in this area. The impacts are far and wide at the economic, social, and mental health realms, but we've seen some progress. You all agree that you've seen some progress, but there's plenty more work to be done, ideally in a coalition kind of way, working together to learn from each other and take collective action, bringing more resources into programs and services, both with police and the human rights side of things, and public education and other ways that we can support the system with investigations and public education and data, and continue to deepen our understanding of the intersections at play, the complexities, and how hate crimes and discrimination and racism and other forms of oppression impact different people in different communities, and how we need to create systems that address those complexities and try to get at the root of racism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and all those forms of hatred and discrimination. So thank you so much for all your great work, all your great expertise and advice. Thank you to OCASI. Thank you to our interpreters. Thank you to our wonderful participants with all your great questions that we were unfortunately unable to get to. I just do want to mention that we've created a link in the chat for the resources. We will send them after the session, as well as an evaluation survey. Please take a couple of minutes to complete that. We also have the previous webinar up on our YouTube channel, OCASI's YouTube channel, and the link to that will be sent out as well. So thanks, everyone. It was great to see you all. Great to have this discussion, and looking forward to continuing to work and collaborate with all of you to address hate and racism and other forms of discrimination. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you so